Well, happy Friday. I'm Tom Strange, curator for the keyboards for Sigal Musical Museum here in Greenville, South Carolina. And today I'm going to bring you three of the smaller keyboard instruments designed for the home and designed not to take up a great deal of space. Not so much what we would think of as particularly portable instruments, but instruments that were designed to be small instruments that could live in the home easily. And we're going to start with an instrument here, a Spinet harpsichord made in London, in this case by Joseph Harris of London, roughly 1750. There were a fair number of Harrises working on spinets at the time. There's Joseph Harris that we see here, William Harris, and there's an example of a William Harris that was in the Sigal collection and may be able to return to the Sigal collection before all is said and done. And then there were other Harrises, including a John Harris that ultimately came to Boston and built instruments there. So when we say spinet harpsichord, what do we mean? Well, when we talk about a regular harpsichord, we're talking about an instrument where the keyboard, if these are the keys going up and down like this, then we would see the strings going in the same direction as the keys. In a virginal, the strings are perpendicular to the keys, and so the strings run like this and the keys run underneath them. And then with a spinet, we've got the strings at an angle to the keys such that the entire instrument is somewhat compacted, and it allows for the instrument to be able to fit a smaller space and yet still have a fairly long bass string. So Joseph Harris saw building in the 1840s or 1740s and 50s for sure. Really interesting example here. You can see the fairly heavy keys, and I'm going to move the camera here and allow you guys a chance to look in a little closer here. So here are the keys, yes, and you can see that the key fronts are ivory as well, and they have arcades cut into them. The keys are fairly thick. And then when we get to the accidentals are two layers of ebony with a layer of ivory in the middle. We call these skunk tail sharps. They look like skunk tails, for want of a better term. And then as we dig a little bit deeper into it, here is the name board, Joseph Harris, Londini Fecit, Latinized as they all were. And then as we look inside, we can see the layout of the instrument. So here's what I'm talking about. The keys would be moving under the strings like this, and here are the string directions, off at an angle to the keys. The rail here is called the jack rail, and the jack rail can come up and we can then look at the jacks. So here are the jacks in place. These are replacement jacks, and in a little bit we're just going to talk about those. And we can hear a little bit of this instrument. Now, I don't think we're hearing a very authentic voice, and I'll tell you about that in a second, but it has a fairly small voice at the moment, and that's due to a number of factors. One of those factors is that when they have redone the jacks, so we've now got a jack that looks like this, and it's got this metal piece down here which is adjustable. I can move it up and down, how very kind of them for us in terms of adjusting the height of the jack, but this is very much from the late 1960s or 1970s and doesn't look a whole lot like the jack that would have been in here. There was a great deal of rethinking their engineering. At some point the instrument was cut for leather plectra, which it probably would not have had in the 18th century. And then those leather plectra wore out. they have been sliced flat, and then Marlowe or someone else has put in some very thin plastic, probably Delrin plectra. So the plectra are quite weak and not exactly what we would expect to find. The other problem with this instrument is that it's strung entirely in steel, which would not have been the case when it was built. Several of the bridge pins have been moved, particularly in the from about the C up here to roughly the E. They've been moved, and they've been moved to make them shorter, and yet the thing is strung in steel. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I don't know when the bridge pins were moved. I would suspect that this thing was strung primarily in brass when it was built, and that pins were then moved and then moved back again, would be my guess. What does it need now? Well, it needs to be completely restrung. Not only did they put it all in steel, but they've used a very, very thin steel throughout. So there's nothing about the gauging of this instrument that's at all right. And this was what was happening in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s when we were looking to bring the instruments back, but how to do it, what should it look like. Wasn't clear and remains unclear as the 1960s and 70s becomes the 1980s. The work of Hubbard and others begins to really catch hold, and we start to find people beginning to remake these things in the way that they should have been made or restored in the first place. So nothing has happened here that I think is completely untoward, but it's an instrument that's going to need a bit of work. And that's not unusual, and because I think the Spinet is a very lovely instrument, because the work is fairly light, reasonably non-intrusive, they have replaced the tuning pins with zither-type pins. I'll probably leave that, but I'll probably will restring it and requill it and bring back some of its true voice. So, the Spinet harpsichord, 1750, a great Sigal instrument. He was really happy when he got it, and we're anxiously waiting on Graham Gadd and others who are now helping Graham to finish a book on the Spinet harpsichord, which I think will be fairly comprehensive for what we're looking for, and hopefully we'll flush out some of the names that we have here that we'd like to know a little bit more about the interaction. So let's go to another instrument that looks a lot like this one and that has a similar bit of name difficulty. And now we can see this wonderful piano, and this is called a Transverse grand piano built by Crang Hancock in 1777. Now, Crang is an unusual name, and even in London, Crang was not something that you would normally run into. And so when we kept running into the Crang name, it caused a bit of confusion, and the reason is this, that there was John Crang, who was the first, he was the elder, and John Crang was making harpsichords and spinets. And then his nephew, or both of his nephews, John Crang Hancock and his brother James Hancock, join in with making these instruments. And so we get this Crang name in there, and now we have John Crang Hancock, we have the old John Crang, and we have James Hancock, and they sort of run together a little bit. The thing to remember is that John Crang Hancock, who worked under the name of Crang Hancock, built the pianos, with James apparently sometimes helping him, and then John Crang built the harpsichord styles. Now, he worked under the name Crang Hancock I think to sort of simplify things, if he'd called himself John Hancock, perhaps it would have worked a little bit better. But these are wonderful instruments. They began by making square pianos in the earlier 1770s, and then on or about 1777, they introduced this transverse grand. How does it differ from everything else? Well, it's a little like the Spinet harpsichord in the way that it's laid out. In other words, we now have the keys like this, and then the strings are coming in at an angle to the keys. And we've got the soundboard, essentially moved over the entire surface of the instrument, more like a grand piano, more like a Spinet harpsichord. And then the hammers can come up behind the soundboard and then strike. In order to make all of this work in a fairly compact form, the action actually drops out from below. So this part from here to here actually unscrews from the case, and the whole action drops down. And that's how you access the action on this instrument. From the top, we have, let me take the camera, and we can see that we have a rail on the top like the jack rail of a spinet. But in this case, it's where the dampers are being guarded. So there's a set of dampers underneath this instrument. And here's the row of tuning pins conveniently located up in the front, very much like what we have in the layout of the spinet. So you can see that this instrument took a great deal of its inspiration from what was going on with the spinet. Even the layout of the bridge here is pretty representative of what we would find going on in a Spinet harpsichord, but now it's in a transverse grand piano. What might this instrument sound like? I will tell you that Tim Hamilton restored this particular piano, and yet for some reason Marlowe has reduced the tension, and so I suspect that he either knew he wasn't going to play it, or for other reasons that he saw, structural reasons, he may have reduced the tension. Anytime we find an instrument where the tension is very far away from where we expected to find it, and yet it looks like it went through some sort of a recent restoration, or in this case we have records that the restoration happened within 10 years, then we can suspect that somebody has dropped the tension for a good reason. And when you find that, then before you go in there and start just willy-nilly pulling tension up, we take a look throughout the instrument and find out where everything is, if anything is shifted, and then we can begin working in the middle, and then we can work down toward the end. In this case, all I've done is tuned a few fifths so that you can hear this piano just a little bit. So as piano sounds go, it's a fairly small sound, sounds very much like a square piano of the time, but in this case, not quite a square piano. Where does it fit in the pantheon of instruments? That's a really good question. It is its own thing, these transverse grands. There's only 6 or 7 of these in the world that we know about, 2 from 1777. And that both of those look exactly like this one, meaning that in this case the tail is a little truncated compared to the later transverse grands where the tail is roughly a foot longer. So when I first looked at this instrument, I thought, well, maybe the tail had been trimmed short to make it fit in a space. But the fact that the other 1777 looks identical to it does tend to suggest that the early ones actually look like this, and I'll tell you that everything else inside looks about right. An interesting aside, when this one came up for auction in the States, I was one of the other bidders that was bidding, back in the day, and I was happy to find out that I was beat out for it, but Marlowe was the person that had gotten it, and I was delighted that it was going to go to such a good home. And then you can imagine that we're very delighted that we have it now to talk about and show the world, and something that when you come to the Sigal Music Museum in the grand opening of Sensational Sigal, this one will be on display. In fact, all three of these instruments that I'm showing today are going to be on display. So, Transverse grand piano, its own sort of creature, but the square piano is a fairly ubiquitous instrument by this time. By 1777, it's been around for 11 years or so, and by 1775, there were over 1,500 that had been made and out in the world. They were going to the West Indies, they were going to Paris, they were coming to America, and Americans were very enthusiastic consumers of these when they could buy them. We didn't have a lot of money in America, and everybody was still sort of scratching to bring things along in these colonial period. One colonial dollar was roughly worth, or I should say, one English pound was roughly worth 7 colonial dollars. And so you can imagine that if something cost roughly 20 to 25 pounds, by the time it came to America, it was well over $100 American money. And so even when the U.S. is minting money and things are going well, only the very wealthy could afford to have a piano. So what do you do when you want one and you can't afford one? Well, you might make one. And so our third instrument, as I swing our podium around, our third instrument is this wonderful little thing here. So here is a little square piano made sometime in the 1790s in rural New England, almost certainly. We can tell that from a lot from the service woods. It's primarily in pine with a little bit of oak and some poplar, as you would normally expect to find. And this is an instrument by someone who had some concept of the piano, but obviously didn't have a model to copy, and was obviously working on doing things besides exactly copying pianos. So what has he or she brought forward? And I suspect it's a he. Well, let's move the camera again, and then you guys can get a better look at this instrument. So here we see the soundboard area. It's a fairly small soundboard area, reminiscent of like an early Zumpy. And then note at the other end, yes, that there really isn't the normal little pocket that we would have on this side that provided some of the structural stability. It simply goes into the back. The hitch pins are along the back rail as they normally would have been, but there's almost no back rail to it. And then you're immediately struck by the fact that this whole thing is single strung. So there's only one string per note. And then I'll point out a few other things because then I'm going to put the camera back and pull some things out to show you. But look along here, along this rail, we can see where stickers once came up through, and below on the key levers there's a little pad that would have caught these. And so clearly this thing had some sort of damper mechanism that damped the strings up to about the middle of the compass. And so it was once being set up to be a full piano, not simply a pentathlon. It has a little lid catch here, and then that may actually have been something that was added later, but this is certainly original to the instrument. And so a fairly sophisticated little lever up there to hold the lid up. The lid is there's no seam in the lid flap here. So the lid, when it comes down, completely closes off the instrument. And so I would suspect that when you were playing this, that you would normally have this little lever up. And then let me take a few things out and show you. So here's the name board. And And you'll notice this additional feature here, a little shoulder molding, and then from that shoulder molding are these brass springs. And these brass springs all fit little grooves in the key levers. And so these are helping push the key lever down, a spring action for the key lever rather than the normal leaded back. Either the maker didn't have lead, didn't know about lead, or decided that this just felt better and worked better. It's more organ-like the way it works. And then I will tell you that underneath each key lever we find a spring right below it, and that spring also pushes back on the key lever. So it gives the whole key very much more of an organ feel than it would normally have. So what can we say about these keys? Well, they're very simply made. They're not carved out in any way, shape, or form. And then you can see it has a little wooden bump at the end, and that's what's going to catch the back of the hammer and push the hammer up. So the hammer travel is really quite far on this. It's over 60 millimeters, and that's about double what we normally find on an instrument, but it still works. And then as far as guiding the keys are actually guided in the front here. So there's a wire on either side that catches each key lever, and then the key levers have been trimmed. I think maybe you can see in the camera here. The key levers have been trimmed so that they just fit into the groove, and it's a pretty good way of tracking the keys. Now I'll point out something else. The instrument has been covered in ivory, but most of the, well, I would say, half of the tails are actually composed of two pieces. It's not simply a crack here. This is a piece, and this is a piece, and they've been brought together. It's as though the maker had a limited supply of ivory, and for the most part, he had these heads that he could cut up, and so he's cut up heads to make this. It could be that it's recycled ivory, and he simply didn't have a lot of tails. It's also possible that because of the fact that he's laying this keyboard out, and it doesn't have the normal wide details, the D key is not wider than the others as it normally is. I suspect it's all sort of made up, and then he made things work as he could. So an interesting combination of American Yankee ingenuity and trying to bring something together so he could make it play. Here's another instrument where, because of its age, its relative rarity, and the fact that at its very best it's going to be a reasonably mediocre instrument, we're not going to bring this up to tension and particularly play it. But I will point out a few other interesting things. So he's got his keyboard here, and when he got down into the bass, he sort of runs out of room. So this B flat, the A sharp key, is actually not a full key. It doesn't go all the way back. It's got a little dummy piece here to hold it up, and it's simply a dummy key to make the spaces work, but completely unplayable, and never was. It never was intended to play. What might such a piano have sounded like? Well, once again, I can tune a few fifths without putting much tension on the instrument, and we can hear. So it's not a bad little sound. Being a unichord with only one string per note, it's going to have a fairly simple, straightforward sound. And certainly not the really big, lush sound that a London piano maker would have had. But this was never intended to be marketed and sold as a piano in competition with the London pianos. This was almost certainly made by someone who wanted a piano either for the church or the family, for the daughter, for someone or themselves, so that they could enjoy a piano in rural, early America. And Michael Cole did some work with some of the curators here in America. This one was actually on display in Boston back in the 1980s. And it's really just absolutely chock full of interesting little bits. So when you come, this is an instrument that I think most folks that would like to research these things, could mine a great deal of information out of. I'm only bringing you a little bit today so that we can talk about some of the instruments in the Sigal collection. Delighted to have them, delighted to share these with you, and I will say that as usual, we're always looking for the feedback and input. So if you can come back to us and bring forward your thoughts, things that you'd like to know more about, we will try to get those to you. We had been doing the Facebook Live, and the difficulty with the Facebook Live is that the bandwidth has gone down tremendously, as so many people are doing so many things during these awkward periods, and I didn't find it reliable anymore. So I'm finding various ways to videotape and to bring these sessions forward to you. Once we are open again, and we're hoping to open the week of June 9th, we're still going to do these. I'm going to beg a little bit of indulgence for a few weeks in June and July as we get ready to launch the great Sigal exhibit. And so I may come back to you with only one a week going forward. Do watch for Ali Cade, our curator for the Woodwinds, who has been bringing forward some very interesting videos. You can also find these on our YouTube channel for the Carolina Music Museum, which will be renamed Sigal Music Museum channel as everything changes over. You'll be able to find all of the videos actually archived there. And then tell us what you want to see, and I will try to bring that sort of thing forward. In the meantime, everybody be good, think about early pianos, and I'll be back to you next week. On Wednesday, we will have an excellent jazz concert with V. Popat and Steve Watson on guitar, the great legendary Steve Watson. You won't want to miss it, so be sure to tune in next week. Have a great weekend, and I'll be back.